The rain had started falling just as I left my last class of the day, a slow drizzle at first, then a steady downpour that painted the sidewalks dark and slick. The air smelled like damp earth and wet pavement, a scent I'd always associated with long, introspective walks. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, cursing myself for forgetting an umbrella. Campus was unusually quiet for a Thursday evening. Most students had already rushed to the dorms or huddled inside the cafe near the library, their laughter and low voices drifting through the fogged-up windows. But I wasn't heading back to my dorm. Not yet. I checked my phone again, rereading the short email that had made my stomach twist the moment it arrived. Mr. Carter, please see me after class today. We need to discuss your latest paper. Professor Hay. There was nothing inherently alarming about it, but something about the wording unsettled me. I had always done well in Professor Hay's class, Literature of the 20th Century. He was a tough but fair professor, known for his sharp critiques and no-nonsense attitude. If he had a problem with my paper, he wouldn't have asked me to stay after class. He'd have torn it apart in front of the whole lecture hall. So why did it feel like something else? The classroom was empty when I arrived, save for Professor Hayes himself. He sat at his desk, his sleeves rolled up, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His dark eyes flicked up when I walked in, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed over his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the same composed expression he always wore. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice smooth, unreadable. "Close the door, please." I hesitated, but did as he asked, the quiet click of the latch sounding much louder than it should have in the empty room. The rain outside had picked up, tapping insistently against the windows, and for a second I wished I was anywhere else. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His tone was calm, too calm. I sat down, gripping the edge of the desk in front of me. My mind raced through every possible reason I could be here. Did I accidentally plagiarize something? Was I failing without realizing it? "You look nervous," he said, his lips curving ever so slightly. I let out a short laugh. "Should I be?" A pause. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "That depends," he murmured. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. Professor Hayes' eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, and I shifted in my seat, suddenly hyper-aware of how close we were in the otherwise empty classroom. The sound of the rain drumming against the windows filled the silence between us. He finally spoke, his voice lower this time. "You're a talented writer, Mr. Carter. That much has been clear since the first paper you turned in." I exhaled, tension easing just slightly. "Thank you. I try." He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "But something was different about your last piece. It wasn't just good, it was personal." My stomach twisted. I knew exactly which piece he was talking about. The assignment had been to analyze a passage from the picture of Dorian Gray, but I had veered off course, letting my own thoughts bleed into the essay. I had written about forbidden desire, about longing that could never fully be spoken aloud. It wasn't just an analysis of Wilde's words, it was a confession hidden between the lines. I swallowed hard. I guess I got a little carried away." He tilted his head, considering me. "Carried away," he repeated slowly. "You wrote about love as something that exists in secret. Something that's felt in the stolen glances and silences between people who can't say what they truly want." A beat passed. My throat felt dry. "I was just interpreting the text," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his desk and pulled out my paper, sliding it toward me. There were his usual margin notes, precise and critical, but I noticed something different this time. He had underlined an entire paragraph near the end. I could barely look at it, but I already knew which one it was. The most painful kind of desire is the one that must remain unseen. To want something and never be able to claim it, to live in a world where every touch is a risk, where every longing glance must be dismissed before it lingers too long, that is a fate worse than denial. It is knowing what you want and knowing you can never have it. I stared down at the words, my pulse quickening. I could feel him watching me, studying my reaction. My hands curled into fists in my lap. "Why did you write this?" he asked. I looked up at him, my mind scrambling for a safe answer, but nothing came. The weight of his gaze, the intimacy of the moment, the rain outside trapping us here, it was too much. "I don't know," I said, my voice quieter now. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something beneath the surface, something restrained. "I think you do," he murmured. The words sent a shiver through me. I wanted to look away, to break the tension, but I couldn't. It was as if the air between us had changed, as if we were standing on the edge of something we weren't supposed to acknowledge. Then he leaned forward just slightly, his forearms resting on the desk. "Tell me," he said, his voice softer, coaxing. "Have you ever felt like that? Like wanting something you weren't supposed to?" The question sent a jolt through me. My fingers tightened around the edges of my paper. "This feels like a weird conversation to be having with my professor," I said, trying for humor, but my voice betrayed me. It was too shaky, too unsure. He exhaled a quiet laugh, but it wasn't amusement, it was something else. "You're right. It is." And yet, he didn't stop. Neither did I. The rain grew louder outside, wind rattling against the windows, but the storm inside this room felt stronger. He leaned back again, his jaw tightening as if he were reining himself in. "There are things we shouldn't say," he continued, "but that doesn't mean we don't think them." I felt my pulse hammering against my ribs. My mind screamed at me to break eye contact, to make some excuse and leave, but I didn't move. I sat there, waiting, hoping. For what, I wasn't sure. Then, finally, he sighed and shook his head, as if he had just realized something. "This was a mistake," he muttered. A strange ache settled in my chest. What was? His fingers curled against the edge of his desk, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Frustration? Regret? I couldn't tell. "I should have just given you feedback and let you go," he said. But instead he stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "It doesn't matter." A long silence stretched between us. The moment, the charged, unspoken thing between us, had almost been named. Almost. But now, he was pulling back, retreating into the safety of professionalism. I should have done the same. I should have said thank you for your feedback and walked out of that room without looking back. But I didn't. Instead, I asked the question I wasn't supposed to ask. "Do you understand it?" He looked at me, brow furrowing slightly. "What?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "What I wrote. Do you understand it?" His jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the papers on his desk. He didn't answer right away. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, he said, "Yes." The single word hung in the air between us, as heavy as the rain outside. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if we were still talking about literature. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The storm outside howled against the windows, the fluorescent light above us flickering slightly, as if the universe itself was hesitating. The air between us had thickened, charged with something dangerous, something unspoken yet undeniably real. Professor Hayes' fingers twitched where they rested on the desk. He was staring at me, but there was something different now, something that had cracked through his usual restraint. His dark eyes weren't just assessing anymore, they were searching. I should have looked away. I should have laughed it off, made some excuse, and walked out of that room. But I didn't. I held his gaze, feeling my own breathing grow shallow. "Mr. Carter," his voice was low, measured, but there was a tightness to it, like he was battling something inside himself. I swallowed hard. "Yes." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "This is—" He let out a quiet, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is exactly the kind of moment where a line should be drawn." His words should have shattered whatever illusion I was holding on to. They should have pulled me back to reality. But instead, my heart pounded harder, because he had acknowledged it. The line. The tension. The something neither of us had dared to name. I leaned forward slightly, my pulse hammering against my throat. My voice came out barely above a whisper. "Then why aren't you drawing it?" His eyes snapped back to mine, and for the first time, I saw it, hesitation. A flicker of something that looked dangerously close to longing. The rain slammed against the window, a sharp gust of wind rattling the glass, but I barely noticed. My world had shrunk down to the space between us, to the tension stretched so tight it felt like a single breath could snap it in half. "Do you know how reckless this is?" he murmured, his fingers curling into a fist on the desk. I nodded. "Yes." "Do you know how much trouble?" "Yes," I repeated, cutting him off. "I know." Something flashed in his eyes. Frustration, conflict, desire, I couldn't tell. Maybe all of them at once. He pushed back from his desk abruptly, standing up, running a hand through his dark hair like he was trying to shake off whatever thought had just crossed his mind. He took a deep breath, but it was unsteady, like it wasn't enough to steady him at all. "This conversation is over," he said, his voice rougher now. He turned toward the window, his back to me, but he wasn't fooling either of us. I didn't move. I should have stood up, grabbed my bag, and left. I should have let him create the distance we both needed. But I couldn't. Instead, I heard myself say, "What are you afraid of?" He went completely still. The room felt colder somehow. When he finally turned back around, his expression had darkened. His jaw was tight, his hands braced on the edge of the desk. "Don't." I swallowed hard. "Don't what?" His gaze flickered down to my lips, so fast I almost thought I imagined it. But I hadn't. "Don't push this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I already had. The air between us had changed again, heavier, like something inevitable was pressing down on us. My skin prickled with anticipation, my breath uneven. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. My body was moving before my mind could stop it. I was closing the space between us, my heart hammering in my chest. His eyes didn't leave mine. He wasn't stopping me. I was close enough now to feel the heat radiating from him, to smell the faint scent of his cologne, something deep, woodsy, grounding. My pulse roared in my ears. "This is a mistake," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. I nodded. "I know." Neither of us moved. The storm raged on outside, but the real storm was here, in this room, in the space between us that was no longer safe. Then, a sharp knock on the door. We both jolted back as if burned, the fragile moment snapping like a rubber band. My breath caught in my throat. Professor Hayes took a step back, his hand gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. His face had changed. Whatever had just passed between us was buried beneath a careful mask of control. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Professor Hayes." A voice, female, unfamiliar. "Are you still in there?" His gaze flickered to me, something unreadable flashing in his eyes before he turned sharply toward the door. "Yes," he called out, his voice steady. "Just a moment." I swallowed hard, my body still buzzing with adrenaline, with everything that had almost happened but didn't. I reached for my bag, my fingers trembling slightly as I slung it over my shoulder. He turned back to me one last time, his expression unreadable. "You should go." I hesitated, wanting to say something, anything, but what was there to say? I nodded once. Then, without another word, I walked out of the room. But as I stepped into the hallway, my chest still tight, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The hallway was dimly lit, the overhead fluorescents flickering slightly as I walked, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My heart was still hammering, my body still humming with the adrenaline of what had almost happened back in that room. I could still feel the heat of Professor Hayes' presence, the weight of his gaze, the unbearable tension that had wrapped around us like an unseen force. I should have felt relieved to be out of there. But instead, I felt untethered. The woman who had knocked on the door, another professor maybe, had barely spared me a glance as I passed her in the hall. Still, I felt exposed, like my body carried evidence of everything that had transpired behind that closed door. I tightened my grip on my bag strap and kept walking. The next morning, I arrived at class earlier than usual, taking my seat in the middle row. The room was already filling up, students chatting idly about weekend plans, flipping through their notes. The normalcy of it felt jarring. And then he walked in. Professor Hayes moved with the same quiet confidence he always did, his expression unreadable as he set down his leather briefcase and flipped open his notebook. To anyone else, he looked the same, collected, professional. But I knew better. His shoulders were tenser. His jaw was locked just a little too tight. He didn't look at me. Not once. It shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. As he began the lecture, his voice steady, measured. I barely heard a word of it. My mind kept replaying last night, the charged silence, the way he had looked at me, the way we had hovered so close to something irreversible. And now, he was pretending none of it had happened. I forced myself to focus, to take notes, but my hand was unsteady as I gripped my pen. Then, near the end of class, it happened. For the briefest moment, so quick I might have missed it if I weren't watching, his eyes flicked toward me. And in that half-second, I saw it. The hesitation. The restraint. The unspoken something still hanging between us. Then he looked away. "Class dismissed," he said, closing his notebook with finality. Chairs scraped against the floor as students gathered their things, filtering out of the room. I didn't move. Not yet. I waited until only a few people remained before finally standing, my chest tightening as I made my way toward the door. I had almost reached it when... "Mr. Carter." His voice stopped me cold. I turned slowly, heart pounding. He was still at his desk, his hands braced against the surface as he looked at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they held something restrained, something caged. A long silence stretched between us. Then, his lips parted slightly, like he was about to say something. But instead, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Never mind." He looked away. Dismissed. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat, nodding once before turning and walking out of the room. But as I stepped into the hallway, the same thought from last night echoed in my mind. This wasn't over. The hallway was colder than I remembered. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe the chill was settling inside my chest, creeping through my veins, coiling around the place where something had almost happened but hadn't. I walked toward the exit, my steps slow, my mind still replaying the moment when he called my name. Mr. Carter. Not Ethan, not anything softer, just formal, detached. And yet, his voice had cracked, just a little. I had heard it. I knew I had. So why did it feel like he had shut a door between us? The thought gnawed at me as I stepped outside. The storm had passed, but the air was thick with the scent of wet pavement and something unspoken. The sun was struggling to break through the heavy clouds, casting weak, uneven light over the campus. It felt fitting, like the aftermath of something that had shaken the world, even if no one else could see it. I pulled out my phone without thinking, my thumb hovering over my email app. I had no reason to check it, no logical excuse to expect anything. But I opened it anyway. And then I saw it. A new message. From Professor Hayes. Subject: "We need to talk." My breath hitched. I read the words again. Then again, as if they might disappear, as if my mind had conjured them out of sheer desperation. But they remained, stark and undeniable. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers trembling slightly as I tapped the screen. Ethan. He had never called me by my first name before. I shouldn't be writing this. I shouldn't have let things get this far. But I can't ignore it anymore. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. Meet me in my office. Tonight. There was no explanation. No context. Just those words. I stared at the screen, my breath coming shallow and uneven. My rational mind screamed at me to delete the email, to pretend I had never seen it, to walk away before I stepped into something I couldn't undo. But the part of me that had leaned in last night, the part that had wanted to push the line just to see if he'd let me, that part had already made up its mind. I turned on my heel, heading toward the library, toward anything that might distract me until night fell. But one question burned in my mind, refusing to be ignored. What happens when I walk through that door?